whether.
Yeah.
So this is, yeah, okay, this isn't picked up itself. Good.
Which one of us is, all right, what I am.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah. Oh, so you rolled a membership with the teacher? Yeah, exactly. I can bring it to like next talk or the one we will have with Alpha. Okay. All right. Or even if we do this Thursday on the Alpha.
It's Wednesday, by the way.
Oh, it's Wednesday.
It's Wednesday, yeah. Because our speaker, because Thursday is second. Cambridge.
Yeah.
So there's a back Monday. So
I mean, just feel free to take some.
but you can have like something giant.
Yeah.
You know, like a stick.
The thing is that when it doesn't swing quite right, it's jams up. It's better just to take your time and let it see their work. So it's generally.
Attending the
Yeah.
That's all it was fun. It's interesting.
Yeah, was there any photo or any photos? Anyone that?
Yeah. I'm pretty sure because I always do it. So
He said Bogaard for the one entire history.
what do you said you from the head and she no. Oh, you wrote I wrote the essay, an essay. I actually never and her name as well. And she also realized.
Wait, how did you miss that EOU?
I wasn't, the problem was I wasn't sure if I could double It's very critical for this.
Right. And it'd be yeah,
Exactly.
right. And it was for her.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so. Yeah, because I like your profile picture.
Cheers.
When did you get the headshots?
That was before coming to you. So,
Really? You look older there.
this thing is 20 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah. In 5 minutes.
Wait, what did we grab? Photograph or photograph? Photograph.
I'm actually doing 90 or something. I can't always in my vision.
90.
She's head of the British Academy or something. But then she also dressed up with
I don't know.
I think would be incredibly funny. She would probably find it extremely old. Yes, of course, but that's amazing. You're already screwed up with Bogaard. I don't think to be Yes, yeah. We had her, so 5 more minutes at 52. So, 3 minutes. Which.
The last song for the message. We generally had one good thing to say. One woman had 3 Bible students who supervised the yeah, so did you go to the panel? Did you attend the panel?
Yeah.
How was it? Lynn was one of the nicest ones. She was smiling.
Imagine what's going around some different places. She's learning to get that as an being very, very polite, very nice people. That's very well. She had a wonderful year.
She's
What was the last call?
It was really good. It was really different from the other one. It was a bit more niche because this woman, her postdoc research, she did like machine learning to understand like she doesn't fail to anthropology. So she was looking at this one fossil, which I forgot. But she was looking at how it looked like she basically looked like so you generally. So she was looking at sexual dimorphism and how people attribute like skulls and enamels to like male or female and draw patterns for it. And she ran through this thing Yeah, so she looked like Paranthropus, which is like an Australopithecus species. And she actually ran machine learning. It was pretty complicated stuff, but it looked at how the patterns are actually inversed. And when humans are looking at the data, they're not able to catch it, even if the data tells them that, because you're looking, so you're associating like thicker particles with male and thinner particles.
Yeah. Sorry?
Yeah.
Wait, what was she?
You need to type this one.
Yeah, there is no waiting room. Yeah.
And the actual pattern is that thicker particles were female and thinner ones were male. Yeah. So basically a lot. So she said that people can do the same thing with other data that's sort of attributed and see whether it actually holds up. Lots of machine learning. I would say I can just like send out an email to your list and see what you want to also,
Are we doing the Thursday?
yeah, I think it's yes, mine will it's 16th of June. And
Is it
Thursday. Yeah. And it's basically like yeah, it's about MSc of architecture.
Sorry, I forgot. Thank you. I will just put my USB in. Fine, thanks. 5 minutes behind where I think I am.
We usually wait 5 minutes for the you still have it.
Thank you for allowing me. Can I ask you all, since we're you all, stop you all talking. I noticed Lynn last week just sat.
Yeah.
Is that what folks normally do?
Yeah, my phone on the laptop is kind of touchy.
Oh,
It's so
okay.
far away, so it's better if it
We'll
goes-
keep it simple,
Yeah.
shall we? Okay.
there's one by the
Yeah.
mouse puppet.
Got it.
Thank you.
That
works. Right to the Explorer. Yeah, right. That's okay. I'll make it big. Got it. There we are. Good. And I should be sensible to copy it to the desktop.
Yeah.
We'll do that. Just check if that worked.
you giving talk this week also on archaeobotany seminar discussion?
No, that's Jade Whitlam. But in fact, Jade, so she's looking at really early, agriculture, and that's tomorrow, and that I highly recommend that. That will be 1 to 2 p.m. So that will be very complimentary. Yeah. No, but that's her. So that's Jade. Jade Whitlam is she was a British Academy Fellow, and now she's doing sort of follow-on work to some of this. So it should be really good. Okay, go ahead and share. No, I should do that, shouldn't I? Oh, yeah. Sorry, I'm being. Right, it's Zoom, not Teams. I'm with you. Okay. So for some reason, I'm just not. Maybe I'm not. I should be able to do this. Somehow it's, oh, maybe I just, oh. That's what I should have done. Oh dear, if this is an intelligence test, I'm not winning. Really? Okay, so I'm gonna share screen. And just that, isn't it? Great. Yeah. Great.
Would you like me to introduce you?
You may, but you could keep it very brief. Yeah.
So hello everyone online and in person. My name is Monty. I'm the incoming president of the Oxford Archaeological Society. So I'll be doing all the talks next year, but it's kind of a dry run for me that Jacob suggested I do. So here I am. Now your speaker, Professor Amy Bogaard, needs no introduction, but I'm going to give her one anyway. She's the head of the School of Archaeology here. She is a professor of Neolithic and Bronze Age archaeology, and her academic interests around early farming and its social implications, which she researches through archaeobotany and present-day observations of farming practice. And today, she's going to be talking to you about early agriculture and inequality in Western Eurasia.
Brilliant, Monty. Thank you so much. Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining. Delighted to be here. It's been such a brilliant series, so I'm really honored to join. And I've got something I've tried to make a little bit different for those of you in the audience who may have possibly heard a little bit of this before. So I thought I would try something by my standards, a bit speculative and a bit of a different approach. So the question that I would like to focus on is this one: does farming agriculture make us more unequal? And the contention that it does is bound up with ideas about domestication, which is a topic I want to dwell on quite a bit today. Ideas about domestication that emerged before we had any detailed evidence for actually what early farming is like and what its consequences were. So this question is one that I would like to address in several parts. And I think I can do this in probably like 40 minutes, so I don't think I need necessarily to take up your whole hour, maybe leaving some more time for discussion. And the way I'd like to do this is first tackling domestication as a topic that already brings with it, in the way that it emerged, certain expectations about inequality. I then want to take a very brief, it is a very brief look at wealth distribution in early West Asian farming communities, just to give you a flavor of what that looks like, and with particular focus on a couple of sites where we have really great evidence. And then even more briefly, in just a few slides at the end, I want to just give you a sense of, for the early European Neolithic, the initial spread of farming, what we can make of wealth distribution there as well. And so in the first part of this talk, I'm going to consider some ideas that came out of a paper published last year. It was, for me, one of the bright spots of one of the lockdowns. Was working on this paper with a brilliant group of people, some of whom are in the department here, Alex Weide and Gregor Larsen, and others spread all over the world. And this was following on from a workshop that we had done with these folks. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, okay. That's good to know. Sooner rather than later. Let me just, you know what, if I unshare and then share again sometimes. Yeah. Because I'm just going to stop sharing and then start sharing. I hope that's the right thing to do. Yeah. Cool. And then I'm going to share. And then I'm going back here. Right, maybe there's just a preference. Max, do you want to come through? Yeah. Because I can just restart.
Stop share. Okay.
I don't know.
I'll give it a try. No, chat. Share screen. Just screen. Oh, we'll share screen 2, which will be that. And then, yeah. There you go. Let's see. And then you, I don't know.
Let me, no problem. Let me just, I just want to make, because that's still. So when I change.
It is not right now. Yeah, so it's sharing what's up on the base. I don't know how to control what.
No, that's my question.
Maybe I can moving your mouse across to the right or the left. It's thinking that there's two screens that are like next to each other, like you've got an extra monitor.
Okay.
And so you slide as though you're going to another monitor. It might go onto that screen.
Yeah, let me, sorry, you're right on my left, and I'm just, yeah. Let me just, so me changing slides here doesn't have any effect there.
It doesn't.
But you're saying that if I, sorry.
Yeah. So yeah, you're gonna need to look behind you. Yeah. So you have to go to the right here, and then I think if you just use the arrows, yeah. So actually, if you just use your arrows, then you don't think it's like that.
Excellent. Okay. So I will just pick up where I left off, and I was just reminiscing about the fun we had at the workshop that inspired this paper. But what brought us together for that workshop was a sense in lots of areas of archaeobotany and archaeozoology and other kind of adjacent fields that are looking at the biological evidence for early farming, that the concept of domestication needs a rethink. It really, really needs to be thoroughly shaken up and sort of deconstructed. And we were inspired also in doing this by the work of one of our co-authors, Charles Stepanov. And he has in turn worked with another archaeozoologist called Jean-Denis Ving. And so there has been a kind of deconstruction of domestication for some time now. And we were picking up the thread of that conversation. But the nub of what we were picking up on here, and what I thought would be a nice jumping off point for my talk, is that domestication, both as a cultural project and also as a word, I mean, as a term, comes up in the 19th century in a very specific European colonial context. And so I would just like to, if I can manage to advance the slide. Oh, through the arrow keys, yes, I'm with you. Okay. It was the work of Charles Stepanov citing earlier anthropological work in the French literature that made me aware of this series of images, of which we chose one for this paper. This is sort of emblematic of what I'm now going to try and sketch out to you. And in so doing, I will explain what this is actually showing. But what we're trying to get at is the way in which the concept of domestication and even the word is coming up in a context in which it's all about cultural domination. And it's all about the control of other species being a tool in inequality building, if you like. And so the context in which this concept first emerges is in that of what were called societies of acclimatization. I don't know if that will be a familiar concept to you, that were founded in the 1850s in Paris and London. And the aim of these societies was to gain human control over exotic animal species and to make these animals economically useful by collecting them from different parts of the world, especially then in imperial domains, and acclimatizing them to European countries. And the famous criterion of domestication that you may be familiar with, and it was very much the way I was taught domestication when I was an undergraduate, which is reproduction under human control, that first came up as a criterion introduced by the founder of the French Society of Acclimatization, Saint-Hilaire, as a rule of international competitions organized for the domestication of exotic species. So submitting wild animals and showing that you could control them and make them economically useful was literally a prestigious game of the European elite. And that's the context of the photograph you can see here, which is Lord Walter Rothschild in front of the Royal Albert Hall with his famous zebra carriage. And you may notice that one of the supposed zebras, it's the back animal in the front pair, is actually a disguised horse. So it's literally a performance. It's literally a kind of make-believe. And so it's about performance, but it's also about inequality. And I think recognizing that domestication as a concept emerged as a kind of tool in imperial domination, conquest, economic exploitation is crucial, and perhaps one of the more interesting places to then begin a discussion of farming and inequality in the deep past is that we have all this baggage around domestication. Now, so far I've talked about animals, but this wasn't just about animals. This was also about hybridization and breeding of European and Asian plant populations. And this goes back to the 17th and 18th century. Again, it's about imperial domains and the subsequent marketing of those new species. So in a sense, the cradle of domestication is nothing to do with the Middle East, Western Asia, or any of the other hotspots of early agriculture. It's actually European conquest, submission, and improvement, as we argue in this paper. So now you could, oh, sorry, I keep looking really, I will get the hang of this. You could argue that you know, that's just where the word comes from, but that has nothing to do with the baggage that it has subsequently brought with it into archaeology. But I think we could point to any number of examples to counter-argue that indeed domestication has brought with it expectations around domination and control. And one of the perhaps best known examples of this, and certainly one that we use in a lot of tutorial reading here, and that you will have come across before, is Brian Hayden's model of domestication as something that particular individuals with a particular self-interest in their political influence create in order to provide food for politically influential feasts. So this is this feasting model. It's coming in part from Northwest Pacific ethnography, and the idea that the reason we get into managing other species at all is for these reasons that stem from the wish to dominate others, self-interest, and what is sort of politically aggrandizing. So I'm just choosing one particular example, but I think we could come up with many others. And so in rethinking domestication in the paper that came out last year, we drew attention to a couple of features that we can pick up from the archaeological record for what actually happens with humans, plants, and animals as they become entangled in new ways in the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. And there are a couple of things that we pulled out as requiring attention. And I'm going to keep looking behind me just to make sure these things are appearing in the way that I intend them to. But one thing is that if there are particular morphological changes in plants and animals that we would consider to do with genetic change in relationship with humans and human selection on other species, whether that's conscious or unconscious, one thing is clear, and that is that the pace of those changes is very uneven, and therefore that the causal background of why those changes are occurring is then not consistent or simple. It's going to be very, very complicated. And as we're going to argue, it's not just about human agency, it's actually about the agency of lots of different organisms, including interactions between domesticates. And so that is the second point here, that we are looking at intertwined agencies, especially in the West Asian case, intertwined between the plant and animal side of the sort of human niche that is involved with these domestication relationships. So that thinking about crop domestication or thinking about livestock domestication, we often have considered those as kind of siloed subjects, but that really, really breaks down on the explanatory potential to understand what is going on, because in fact, they turn out to be entangled, as I will try. And then the third thing, that we drew attention to is that for all of the interest that there has been and continues to be in notions of competition and again, kind of control and domination that have to do with domestication, what is really obvious from the archaeological evidence is that there is a huge amount of cooperation, both between the species that are involved in this, but also amongst the human members of the community. So it isn't simply about people trying to get one over on each other somehow through these interactions with other species. There's actually a sort of cooperative, almost kind of superhuman lineage level agency going on. So I'd like to illustrate this by looking at early farming in Western Asia, and specifically a region where I've worked in central Anatolia. But in fact, I'm going to be drawing on the work, as I will try and acknowledge all the way through the talk, of other people in our school. And I'd just kind of like to give you a sense of some of the other aspects of work that are ongoing. And I think it was mentioned just before the talk began that there is a related, very pertinent conversation that will happen tomorrow in the archaeobotany discussion group in a presentation by Right, so a map. And this is a map showing the sort of central and western part of the West Asian zone where we have a lot of early farming evidence. The reason I'm showing you this map is actually to emphasize the inset map that you can see in the lower right-hand corner. And that is drawing attention to the way this particular region of Western Asia, Central Anatolia, South Central Turkey, that I'm going to focus on, the way its conceptualization has changed as part of a greater fertile crescent. So that black line that you can see in the little inset map is more or less the zone of the foothills of different mountain ranges that form this of potential rain-fed farming that we call the Fertile Crescent. You may be aware that there was an earlier conception of the Fertile Crescent that actually related to the Tigris and Euphrates of Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley as a kind of Fertile Crescent of civilization. So that had shifted northward as archaeologists got more interested in the progenitors, the ancestors of what become domesticated plants and animals that we find further to the north in this rain-fed zone. And there's a similar shift that has gone on in recent decades to do with Central Anatolia. So you can now see that the gray shading in that inset map isn't just confined to the arc itself. It's now extending up into the Turkish, the Anatolian peninsula, very much an acknowledgement of the archaeological evidence that I'm going to present now for consequential early farming development beyond the Fertile Crescent as classically defined. And so our first stop on this very necessarily strategic tour of the Central Anatolian Neolithic is a really key site in the Central Anatolian sequence called Aşıklı Höyük. And I'm drawing here on the work of a big international team led by Mihraban Özbaşaran at Istanbul University, but also including Dr. Müge Ergun, and I've included Müge's photo here. Müge is actually a postdoctoral researcher here in the school, but for her doctoral work, which she did in Paris at the Natural History Museum, she was working on the Aşıklı archaeobotanical material. So this is charred, mostly charred, carbonized plant material that preserves the direct evidence of what people are doing with, in this case, plants. And we'll talk about animals shortly, but in terms of the plant material, what's amazing about Aşıklı Höyük is that we have this, as it were, stop motion sequence stratigraphically through the agricultural transition. So taking us right the way from the later part of the 9th millennium BC, the late 8000s BC, and into the later 8th millennium, the later 7000s BC. And over that 1,000-year or so span, there is a localized crystallization of farming, very much in terms that become recognizably Central Anatolian and different to what happens in other regions of Western Asia. So that as part of this rethinking of domestication is we can no longer talk nonsense about there being a single point of origin or a eureka moment or a particular local setting that has priority. It's about it being a multi-regional development. And so I'm just showing you the Central Anatolian version of that. What Müge's work showed and what is summarized in the bar chart, the sort of red and green colors that you can see in the lower left-hand corner, is one of the key features that archaeobotanists conventionally look for in terms of domestication. And what it shows is that a particular group of the cereals, a particular kind of wheat that was being exploited at Aşıklı Höyük was in a state of semi-domestication. So the green shading shows a domestic type of cereal morphology, which I'll explain what that is in a minute. And the red shading shows the wild type. And so what you can see is that there is a kind of 30-70, 40-60, 50-50 mixture of wild and domestic all the way through this 1,000 years. And we're going from the earliest levels on the left to the later levels on the right. So one thing to say about domestication as it's emerging is sometimes its emergence is extremely gradual. There is no kind of instantaneous development or particular event horizon. It's actually flatlining in a sense through this 1,000-year period. Now, I just want to explain real quick what I mean in this technical sense about domestication. So one of the ways people have thought about domestication, and this will take you back to first year lectures that I know you've had to sit through before, so I'll just be very brief, with the loss of the natural seed dispersal mechanism. So when the wild wheats, wild barleys, wild oat, which grows naturally in this country, when they ripen, the seeds naturally fall off the plant. So there is a shattering habit, as it's called, and that is part of the natural dispersal mechanism of these cereals. What happens with domestication is that for whatever reason, there is a selection for the anti-shattering or the non-shattering mutation. And actually, this is probably a couple of genetic mutations that control that behavior. So there were ideas going back decades that this was quite an abrupt selection and that it was even intentional, or if not intentional, that it was nevertheless very particular human activity, such as a particular kind of harvesting. So harvesting with a harvesting knife or sickle. I'm going to leave that there for the moment and move on to the next slide. And this is a set of images that have to do with what is happening in the contemporary levels at Ashikli-Huyuk. So through the very same 1,000-year sequence, but now in terms of animals. And what these authors are pointing out is that there is a very clear, steady through time from hunting of a varied spectrum of smaller and larger animals and towards a focus on caprines. And caprine is just the collective term for sheep and goat. It's mostly sheep here. There's some goat as well. And together with that shift in interest in caprines, there is, and this is kind of the real kind of clinching argument, micromorphological evidence, which is the colorful kind of photos you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, for dung accumulating in and amongst these dwellings where sheep are being parked, right? So where they're being penned and that dung is accumulating. So animals here are also in a kind of state of semi-domestication. They are being managed, but the morphological changes that can necessarily follow from management are taking some time to emerge. And what is then clear is that these changes in cereals and in sheep are happening at the same time. They're actually two sides of ecological coin. They're both parts of the early farming niche that is emerging here. And this is something that we tried to look at on a broader regional scale in the paper, the Reconsidering Domestication paper, where we are actually looking through the same centuries and millennia at changes in cereals and in sheep. So sheep are one of the better documented early animal species that are involved in these domestication relationships. I've alluded already to when I was an undergraduate, so that was a couple decades ago. A couple decades before that, it was thought that animals were domesticated prior to crops. That would be the view of the 60s and 70s. By the time you get to the 80s and 90s, it was thought that crops were domesticated before animals. Now we're in a position where it seems that they are actually moving at the same time. The morphological change is more or less simultaneous. So rather than it being, I don't know, one particular activity, it's actually a mutual interaction in some necessarily complicated way between what people are doing, bless you, with crops and what people are doing with sheep. And I guess I'm trying to push the idea that then, rather than seeing this as humans doing something to other species, it's actually different species doing things to each other as much as anything. Okay. Now, to make a long story short, by the time you get to about 7,500 BC, so mid-8th millennium, and panning back now from central Anatolia, so we're looking at the whole region of Western Asia, so the greater Fertile Crescent. This is the kind of summary that is apparent in the current literature. Sorry, it's a work in progress because I keep tinkering with it as new papers come out, and it's probably already out of date. And I've got abbreviations in there that I'm not even going to explain. But what I will tell you is that you've got slightly different set different sets of serials and pulses, and also different sets of that I underlined at the bottom in each of those colored things in different regions of Western Asia. So it isn't even as though this mixed farming thing, mixed meaning combining, it's not as though this even only happened once in one particular way. It's actually happening simultaneously in different ways through these first couple thousand years of the Holocene. Okay, now I'm going to zoom back in on a site of Central Anatolia that Timo and Vaneshri know I was going to talk about sooner or later. And that is the site of Çatalhöyük, which is another settlement mound later than Aşıklıhöyük, and quite a ways to a little bit to the south and to the west. So we're now in the Konya plain. So if anyone been to Konya to see the whirling dervishes, it's an amazing place. And the landscape that surrounds it is very, very distinctive. It was a former lake basin, a paleo lake, Konya, that has dried out by the time we get to the Holocene. So we're looking at a pretty steppe open landscape today that was developing, of course, over the early Holocene. This is just a kind of summary of chronology. So the Çatalhöyük sequence takes us from around about 7100 BC to in totality to the mid 6th millennium. So it's about 1500 plus years. So we're looking at just gargantuan periods of time here where these early farming communities proving resilient to climate change and all sorts of social tensions. And another talk could really just be about that resilience. But here, what I'm going to draw your attention to is what of domestication, and then we're going to look at wealth distribution. So this is a pair of illustrations that Katie Kaleki has produced over the winter. So this is all quite recent. This is for a paper that's going to come out later this year. And it's trying to capture in 2 different seasons of the year, so which would be late summer and a wetter season in the spring, what the landscape around Çatalhöyük is like, because it's so unlike the and this has taken quite a lot of geomorphological work that has been led by lately Jana Ayala, who's at the University of Sheffield, and geography at Durham. So they are co-authors of this paper, and been able to show is that the site is, these sites are also, of course, part of the agency and part of the domestication story. It isn't just about species and organisms moving around the landscape. There's very specific that are involved. And here, these communities have what seems to have been a kind of a sweet spot on the edge of a wide braided channel belt, about 1 kilometer wide. This is one of the rivers that's coming out of the Taurus Mountains to the south of the Konya Plain and onto this flat former lake basin. The settlement mounds of the East Mound occupation, the Neolithic occupation, is what is reconstructed just alongside that. And what we've been able to show through modeling, including looking at rainfall variability, contemporary rainfall variability, and sort of projecting that back to this climate, is that we're looking at a whole series of different hydrological conditions as you move away, as you move across the channel belt, and then as you move away from the edge of the channel, from wet to dry. That would be a predictable gradient. Its precise position would change each year depending on exactly rainfall levels, et cetera. But essentially, reason I call this a sweet spot is that if you're an early agriculturalist, you have a set of crops to work with. Those crops have complementary ecologies, requirements, and so on in terms of water, which is the primary limiting factor for crop growth in this semi-arid region. And so they've hunkered down in a place where they have lots of different options for wetter to be able to, deploy this repertoire, very dynamic and diverse repertoire of crops that they have. But what's going on in this landscape, and which you can't see in this one, in this reconstruction because it's panned back so far, is that there are lots and lots of sheep beetling around the landscape, okay? And I don't know if, I mean, all of us are familiar, certainly from the British, upland farming system with sheep moving around the landscape. But what you have to imagine here is sheep working with a partly arable landscape. So they are nibbling in and around the edges of fields, and in certain seasons of crop growth, they can actually enter those fields and do useful things. So one of the things that sheep do is they obviously nibble the herbaceous, the leafy parts of plants. And if you let them do that on wheat and barley crops that are growing at a fairly early stage, it actually promotes the growth of crop plants that are wider and less prone to what's called lodging. If any of you have driven around Oxfordshire and seen huge swathes of barley fields or wheat fields around here sometimes where the plants have just fallen over, it looks like something has flattened them. It's when they're being soils and they get top heavy and they just, what's called lodge, they fall over, they rot, and the crop is lost. So one of the traditional ways of preventing that happening is that you get sheep to nibble the crop at an early stage. So it isn't eating the grain because it's still vegetative. It's before the ears have emerged. And so I'm just trying to give you a sense of how these species interact and actually make the system work better. Of course, the sheep are manure. We have isotopic evidence for the effect of that being penned in and around the houses at Châteaubriand. So that is a huge concentration then of nutrient-rich material that is sort of bleeding off the mound and enriching the fields that immediately surround it. So there are all kinds of complex interactions going here, but sheep is one of the key players. And then I wanted to acknowledge also some other new work that's coming out of the archaeobotany lab here in the school. And this is work by a DPhil student called Tina Rushanafas, who's the lead author of this paper. And what this paper is actually looking at is very, very, very detailed measurements of grain and grain size and shape. So Tina takes lots and lots of photos of cereal grains that are carbonized, ancient cereal grains from Châteaubriand. And she's able to see that there are very gradual changes through time that suggest, again, a very gradual domestication process. So we're moving from smaller, slimmer grains to sort of shorter, plumper grains. But these are not changes that you and I, even I, after all the years of staring down a microscope, we couldn't pick these differences out. You need to do what's called geometric morphometrics to pick them up, right? So you take lots of really good photographs, you draw an outline of the grain, you put landmarks on that outline, and then you do stats to try and differentiate these grain shapes through time. And it's a technique you may be familiar with that is used with faunal remains as well, teeth and bones, to look at shape change. And to make another long story short, domestication is still ongoing as a form of genetic selection at Châteaubriand. Grains are getting plumper, and there's also a gradual shattering, that same shattering habit that we were talking about before in one particular kind of wheat. And just to make it more complicated, sorry, this is a kind of wheat that has since gone extinct. So it took a while to realize that we were looking at a different species, but it's something called Timofeeves wheat, named after the biologist who first identified it. Triticum timofeevi is the Latin name. And this is now emerging as probably Central Anatolian domesticate that actually did spread into Europe with the expansion of farming, but subsequently went extinct and is now very rare indeed. In fact, there's only certain parts of the Caucasus where it could still be observed under cultivation in the early 20th century. So domestication is lengthy, it's complicated, it's multi-causal, and it has as much to do with the other species involved as it does with whatever humans are doing. But of course, there is human agency involved in this too, and it's high time that I talked a little bit about that. And this is again trying to spotlight some other work for you that is ongoing in the school. So there's quite a lot of activity around early farming. a key question that we need to ask if we want to understand what is the human role then in domestication is, for plants, when does cultivation begin? So cultivation means that cycle of annual tillage and sowing of seeds, and then the cycle begins again the next year. So the question is, when do we start doing that? Now, a key paper on this is actually going to come out on Thursday, this Thursday, that is led by my co-author, Alex Weide, Dr. Alex Weide, who is a postdoc in the School of Archaeology and has led this work. And we've also been very fortunate to work with Jade Whitlam, who is the speaker in tomorrow's talk that I mentioned for Archaeobotany Discussion Group, who's also working on early farming and is a related study. And the paper I'm showing in the slide, precursor paper to the paper that's going to come out on Thursday. And in this paper, we were setting up the potential for a new method of how you diagnose when cultivation is happening. And I'm not going to go into the full story of how that diagnosis has changed, but I do want to highlight to you the importance of this question of starts, because it turns out not to start the point that you would have thought it might have started. I'm being very coy, but we're going to have some kind of press release on Thursday, so I will draw it to your attention when. But Alex Weide, in his doctoral work, actually looked at this another way, which is very interesting. And this was doctoral work that he was doing at the University of Tübingen. And what he found was that if you look at how early farmers are storing their crops, so literally where they, accumulate those stores and how they sort of manage them in relation to domestic architecture, what you find is that there's a particular time frame, which again is sort of taking us to the 7000s BC, when people start to build storage facilities in their houses, in a nutshell. One or two room structures that have perhaps a corner, a couple of corners, or one side of one room kind of boxed off, just used for storage. So that's what we start to see in this time frame of the later 9th to the 8th millennium BC, so the late 8000s and into the BC. And what Alex was able to show in this paper that was also just published last year is that at the same point at which you start storage, you get an uptick in selection for that non-shatter in cereals. So suddenly some of these domestication processes seem to be accelerating. Now, is this domestication as domination? Is this Bryden-Hayden-esque competitiveness? Because in a sense, people are keeping their crops in their own houses. Does this mean that they're getting very sort of self-interested about it? And probably in the sarcastic way I just said that, you can tell that I don't think that's the case. But in fact, the big social about these early farming settlements, and I'm using examples here from central Anatolia, is that they are all about the collective. So sure, there are individual and very similar looking houses that are now increasingly containing their own storage. But rather than being off by themselves in the landscape and surrounded by their own fields and just kind of doing their own thing and being sort of competitive perhaps at a distance, they insist on living in what looks for all the world like a kind of a beehive or some kind of anthill. That they are really, really, really clustered very, and that it's particularly extreme actually in central Anatolia. And when we look at the actual activities that are happening in those houses, yes, they are storing crops in this new kind of private. One of the key arguments then that Alex Weide has made about this is that crops privately, they are accelerating genetic selection. That Jakub and Timo and I are all growing our own crops. And at the end of each year, we mix our harvests together. And we store either communally or we just say that, you know, each of us gets a certain cut. In that particular scenario, any genetic selection inadvertently caused in his field will get diluted because it'll get mixed with the crops that I did and the crops that Jakub grew as well. But if we each crops individually, and if Timo's doing something a bit funky, again, not deliberately, because these are teeny tiny changes that no one would ever notice, and very, very slow changes. But if for whatever reason you're doing something a little bit different, in effect will take hold quicker because you are storing privately and you are sowing with your seed to create the next generation. So that's the very clever argument that Alex Bida has developed, and that seems to coincide with this change in the pace of domestication. But this isn't about people, you know, trying to domesticate anything. This is just about them doing a certain behavior, in this case, wanting to reap what they sow. So literally wanting to be able to, you know, what they've grown through the sweat of their brow, and it having this inadvertent effect on selection. And what I'm also showing here, it's on the right-hand part of this, one of the key pieces of evidence that I think makes this such a salient. And that is that in some of these early farming communities, we get burned, the ones that are shown here in the light gray shading, that have those crop stores in situ. So the burning, it turns out, may be deliberate, not come on to that in a minute, but it is showing that storage is happening in houses. That's just unarguable that is the case. So let's look now for a sec at wealth distribution. Is it the case that with this, you know, these albeit unconscious changes that domestication, is it that this is converging with a kind of behavior of dominance, a kind of greater interest in expressing inequalities and so on? Well, there certainly are real dimensions and possessions between houses. That is true. And I've picked out here a particularly small and a particularly large house from one neighborhood in Çatalhöyük. These are contemporary, so we're now 500 BC, 6600 BC, mid-7th millennium. And the little house that you see on one side is about 12 meters square, and the bigger house that you see on the other side is more like meters square. So there's 5 between them. They do differ appreciably in their size. And what's interesting is that if you sort of tabulate those differences, storage capacity and house size, and there are formal ways you can do this into today, it looks as though those material, I won't call them inequalities, but material differences are particularly striking in this time frame of the middle Neolithic sequence. So we're 1,000-year occupation of Çatalhöyük. So the question is, where does it go from here? Does it get more so? Do we see greater and greater material disparity equaling inequality, or what happens? And in fact, what happens, I just have to remember what happens is that people start burning, and they start burning them with their contents still in. Now, it may not be all of the contents of the house. It may still be some way, but there is a deliberate, seemingly, destruction. Would have been incredibly labor-intensively produced food and other goods. So this is one particular house of this burned type that suddenly appears in this phase where we disparities. Building 52, that was just numbered according to, as these things were identified through survey and excavation. But one thing I wanted to point out about Building 52 makes it unusual is that it was originally 2 separate houses that got knocked together. So that's kind of interesting. There's something a little bit funky about the origins of this particular structure. And you can see that, I'm just going to stand up for a moment just to point that out. So you can see the outline of the building. But you can see running up its center is a double wall. And this is a big no-no in the architecture of Châteauneuf. We don't build houses like that. What was actually happening is that we had two separate buildings, right? And here was the other. This was just a narrow kind of several room house that got knocked through at a particular point in time. And this is a couple of examples of that at Châteauneuf of houses kind of converging to make bigger units, which is in and of itself kind of interesting. And what happens with building 52 is that at the point at which it had burned, it was full of goodies. So the small room that you see towards the top that has lots of, they just look like dark gray circles, but those were clay bins that we were able to excavate, you know, layer by layer. It was just an amazing experience. And they were full of crops, different crops that were probably in different perishable containers. So nuts, as well as cereals, as well as pulses. There was a whole. Also in that, the metapodials of sheep, so the lower leg bones of sheep that were used to make bone points. So it wasn't just food, it was also other kind of useful raw materials, consumables that were kept in that little storage room. In the main living space, which you see as space 94, which would be the first room that would be entered from the roof. You may recall that Châteauneuf is Pueblo-like in that sense. There's nothing actually stored there, but what is immediately apparent as you would enter the room down a ladder is a display of wild cattle horns and heads. And so this is part of an argument that I've developed elsewhere with other co-authors and that I wasn't going to dwell on too much here, that what is actually on display and what is being celebrated isn't the farming, it's the sharing of meat from these large wild places. So if there's any kind of feasting going on here, it isn't to do with the domestication of crops to, you know, make bread for a feast. It would seem to be the sharing of meat that, after all, would be very difficult to store. To invest it socially is a way of kind of sharing it, storing it socially. And that is part of the whole social cohesion system of this kind of densely agglomerated community. So it's not that there isn't competitiveness. It's not that there isn't self-interest. I'm not some kind of hippie commune where everyone's kind of, you know, not interested in themselves at all. There are kinds of forms of display and performance that suggest that, but they don't have anything directly to do with the domestication processes as I've tried to outline them. This is another of the burned buildings under excavation, and I just briefly wanted to show you this. I'm going to scoot ahead. It's going to take too long than I did. This is where we have all kinds of stuff left in the house at the point at which it burned down. And what's interesting here, and this has been pointed out by Karen Wright, who's an archaeologist at the Institute of Archaeology at UCL, is it would appear to be the case from all of the material, especially groundstone material on the floor of this building at the point at which it burned down, that there is almost an anti-inheritance principle. You are deliberately destroying really difficult to obtain and carefully worked grinding stones. So it isn't just about food. I've been talking to a co-author and an economist rather than an archaeologist, Sam Bowles, as well. If archaeological evidence is really where we can argue that there is practices that try to prevent intergenerational transfer of what you might regard as material wealth. Okay, now there's all kinds of human agency involved and all kinds of interesting things happening here, but it would be difficult, I would argue, to see domestication processes as something that elites are weaponizing to get it over on anyone else, as I hope I've made clear. Now, oh, I'm going to skip that. That's Lisa Yeoman's excavating. Okay, just in the last couple of slides and very briefly, I just kind of want to, you know, for what this means for the bigger question of early farming and inequality, because I think you know, the narratives that we tell, even about these very early prehistoric periods to do with farming, are politically influential. I really think they are. So I think it's important that we get this right and that we get the story out there. This is a map that is showing the charting the spread of farming across. The question is, as farming spreads, is that where we start to see inequality kicking in as a consequence of farming and of the movement of some of these species involved in domestication relationships that are moving out from Western Asia? And I mean, the short answer is no, it isn't. And I borrowed some I made them a bit too small, but some very interesting images, my colleague, to show here. And what I've simply plonked on top of that map, some pictures of housing in Asia. That's Ain Ghazal, which is in the modern city of Amman in Jordan. Some Greek Neolithic houses, that's Achaleion, which is in the Thessaly region. And then on the left, this is a recently excavated set of houses, County Down, Ireland. And all the way across, I'm just kind of trying to bookend, you know, the spread of farming. We have very modular, very similar looking houses. And I'm going to borrow on even more widely here on other people's ideas. The Portuguese archaeologist João Zielhau and also the archaeologist John Robb at Cambridge have both written about the idea that the spread of Neolithic farming, you could see in a way as kind of the search for a better Neolithic, right? It's a social experiment that keeps repeating itself over and over again as different societies, different communities try and get it better this time. And I think one of what they're trying to achieve is that insistence on resisting the potential for differential accumulation from farming and the potentials of, you know, just the vagaries of farming productivity as that plays out between different households. It would seem to me to be a remarkable achievement that they resist those, sorry, I'm trying to shorten this, that they resist what might be seen for inequality stemming from differential production, surplus accumulation, and so on. And I think I will simply finish there because I have a couple more slides, but they are just sort of elaborating points that I've already been able to make. Ooh, I will just show you this though, because this is just, these are clay house models from the Neolithic of Greece. And those are just examples of a much wider Greek and Balkan tradition actually depicting the social institution that is so central. And these are all from the late Neolithic. So this is getting into the late 6th and 5th millennium BC. And what models share is that they are focused on the interior of the house. So again, it's not about looking at the house as some kind of mansion that you're trying to elaborate from the outside. Looking into the structure, and I just want to point out to you, in case it isn't clear what you're seeing. So this is one of these late Neolithic house models where there is no roof. The whole thing has been, you know, sort of metaphorically cut away, and you're looking straight into a room. So we're looking at activities that take place. Here's another example. This is from Timba Pramastis in the Western Macedonian part of kind of central northern Greece, where the roof is removable. So you can literally look, it's about looking into the house and the things that are happening there. Here is a remarkable house model as it was found under excavation of a lakeshore site, again in Greek, Western Macedonia, and again, you can see one of these domed ovens. So it's all about the modularity, the predictability, the modesty kind of these houses. So that's my way of understanding it. There are also some really amazing examples like this one, where you can see animal heads hung either side of the door that perhaps do have something to do with feasting and hospitality. But notice again how that's about animal farming. Well, could be, in this case, we can't tell if they're domesticates or not, but it would seem to be about meat sharing. And I just wanted to acknowledge at the end, and I haven't done justice to their work by any means, but this is just a sampling of some of the people whose work inspires me, including other people in the school. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think we're going to see if we have time for the question.
Sure. No, I know I've cut it fine. I've cut it fine. Well, at least I got to finish. So
We'll wait. I just have a quick one.
Please, Monty.
You mentioned that there was like a conceptual sort of fertile crescent before the fertile crescent. I actually didn't do elaborate.
Yeah, of course. Yep. Yep. So it's the crescent is coined in the. Oh, of course I can. Yeah, because that was a good one. So Monty has just asked about this, the emergence of the term Fertile Crescent, and how this originated as an idea about a sort of arc of riverine civilizations extending from Mesopotamia and then down the Nile Valley. So the term Fertile Crescent comes from the work of an aerial photographer and archaeologist, Breasted, who was a University of Chicago archaeologist and was part of a number of expeditions in Egypt and in the Middle East, and literally had a kind of bird's eye view of what was happening. And so, yeah, so the original idea was Nilotic and Mesopotamian civilization are kind of the original fertile because they're well-watered hotspots of, in that understanding of the early 20th century, not just later urban civilizations, but of farming itself. And what happened was subsequent work by other, including archaeologists like the Braidwoods, Linda Braidwood, that was a husband and wife team that are well known for excavating sites like Jarmo, which is on the Kurdistan side, so on the eastern side of the Fertile Crescent. And what they drew attention to was to look at early plant, human, and relationships. You need to look at where the ancestors of those domesticates naturally reside, and they don't now river valleys that Henry Breasted was interested in. They actually are in the flanks, so the foothills of the Taurus and Anti-Taurus and Zagros mountains, and also the uplands of the Levant. And so the notion further to the north to focus on that. And then really it's the archaeological by like the University of Istanbul team I mentioned, and Turkish colleagues that has really focused on this region that is outside of that hilly flank zone as narrowly defined, but is clearly involved in these early developments as well. So the whole thing just keeps getting broader and shifting further northwards. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, I'm very sorry.
No problem. I arrived late, so maybe we could, because I think there was another question. I'm happy to just walk and talk with folks. Okay. Yes. Sure. Thanks.
Excellent.
Sorry, it's not.
Bye, guys. Thank you. Stop. It's not there.